All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. You've provided a really interesting collection of
Yeah,
excerpts.
it's quite a mix. It's going to give us a lot to talk about, I think.
For sure, we'll get into some of his most famous deductions, but there are also some lesser-known passages in here,
Yeah.
ones that I think
Yeah.
really show how much depth there is to these stories.
Yeah, and uh, and I'm excited to go beyond just, the surface level.
Right. Like, how does Holmes actually do it? What's the method behind the magic?
And what makes those cases so captivating?
Exactly. And maybe even more interesting,
Hmm.
how do these stories written over 100 years ago still resonate with readers today?
And how might Holmes, a product of Victorian London, how might he approach the mysteries we face in the modern world? I think that's something to think about.
Definitely. Okay, so let's start with that foundation of Holmesian deduction.
Okay.
You sent over that scene where Holmes examines Watson's shoe
Yes,
and deduces all this information just from that.
it's a classic. But instead of just saying, "Oh, Holmes is brilliant,"
Right.
let's actually break it down. What's he seeing? What details on that shoe lead him to his conclusions?
Well, he looks at the mud, the wear patterns, even how the laces are tied.
Mm-hmm.
And from those seemingly insignificant details, he paints a picture of what Watson's been up to.
Precisely. But he's not using magic. It's not intuition.
Right.
It's a system. It's logical inferences based on knowledge and experience.
So it's not just about seeing the clues, it's about knowing what they mean, connecting the dots in a way that most of us wouldn't even.
Exactly. And that's where the real brilliance comes in.
Yeah.
It's not just observation. It's
Yeah.
analysis,
Yeah.
synthesis, seeing the patterns and drawing those conclusions.
That reminds me of that other excerpt you picked out, where Holmes identifies a client as a doctor
Oh, yes.
based on the scent of iodoform and the bulge of a stethoscope in his hat.
Mm-hmm. But, that makes me wonder,
What?
could he have been wrong? Could those clues have pointed to a different profession?
Hmm.
I mean, using stereotypes like that.
Good point. So maybe his deductions, while impressive, aren't always foolproof.
Exactly. And that's what makes these stories so compelling. We get to play detective alongside Holmes.
Uh-huh.
But we also have to think about the limitations and the potential for bias.
For sure. And speaking of seeing connections others miss,
Yeah.
you included the Red-Headed League,
Oh, a great one.
where Holmes uses this tiny detail,
Mm-hmm.
the worn knees of Jabez Wilson's assistant,
Yes.
to uncover a bank robbery plot.
I love that one.
Mm-hmm.
It shows how Holmes combines his knowledge of human behavior
Right.
with his understanding of how criminals operate.
Mm-hmm.
He sees that connection.
Mm-hmm.
Worn knees equal digging a tunnel.
It's brilliant. He puts those seemingly unrelated details together, just
Like a puzzle.
He completes the picture.
And that's why he's such a fascinating character. We're drawn to his ability to find order in chaos.
Yes. And to find meaning in the mundane.
Absolutely. And he does it with such flair. He's not just a detective. He's
Oh, he's a performer?
yes,
He's a showman. Uh-huh.
reveling in the theatricality of his deductions.
Absolutely. And that's definitely part of his enduring appeal.
Right.
He makes deductions seem like an art,
An art form. Yeah.
a dazzling display of intellect.
Hmm.
Speaking of which, you picked an excerpt that hints at Holmes's more,
Enigmatic side?
yes, his love of solitude,
Mm-hmm.
his taste for that introspective German music,
Oh, yeah.
his need for Watson as his Boswell.
Right. He all adds these layers to his personality.
Like, he exists in this world of logic and reason,
Mm-hmm.
but he's also a creature of passion and emotion. He dislikes the commonplaces of existence.
And needs that intellectual stimulation.
Right. And of course, we can't forget about,
Oh, the cocaine.
yeah, his occasional use of cocaine when he isn't working on a case.
A bit controversial for the time, wasn't
But
it?
sure, it speaks to the complexities of his character
Uh-huh.
and the time period these stories were written in.
A good reminder that even brilliant minds
Yeah.
can have their vices.
And that Holmes, despite his genius, is ultimately human.
Flawed, just like the rest of us.
Which leads us to another interesting point,
Okay.
his relationship with Watson.
Ah, yes.
You chose some passages that really highlight their dynamic.
Well, it's clear that Watson is so much more than just a sidekick.
Right.
He's the narrator, the confidant,
Right.
the voice of reason to Holmes's eccentricities.
Exactly.
Mhm.
He's the lens through which we experience these stories.
Mm-hmm.
Without Watson, it would just be a bunch of dry case files.
Right.
He's the one who brings in that human element.
Yes, the emotional resonance.
Exactly. He provides the context, the humor.
And sometimes I think the frustration.
Oh, definitely. Of being Holmes's closest companion.
For sure. And let's not forget, Watson is the one who chronicles the cases.
Yeah.
He preserves Holmes's legacy.
It's almost like he understands the significance of Holmes's work even better than Holmes himself.
And their dynamic, it's just so compelling. This brilliant, eccentric detective and this loyal, more grounded doctor.
It's that classic pairing. The mind and the heart.
Logic and empathy.
They're working together to solve these baffling mysteries.
Don't you find it interesting how Watson, a man of science,
Yeah.
is often the one who is in awe of Holmes's deductions?
Like he represents us, the readers. He mirrors that fascination we feel.
Exactly.
He asks the questions we would ask, voices our doubts.
And ultimately helps us understand Holmes's brilliance.
You're right. It's through Watson that we see the full scope of Holmes's genius.
But also his flaws.
Yes, his vulnerabilities.
And by doing that, Watson makes Holmes more relatable, more human.
He reminds us that even the most brilliant minds need someone to share their discoveries with.
Someone to ground them.
Right.
And I think that's a key part of why these stories still resonate with people.
Yeah, it's not just about the mysteries. It's about human connection, friendship.
A shared journey.
And that journey takes us into the heart of Victorian London.
Oh, yes.
You've got some excerpts here that really paint a vivid picture of the era.
London becomes almost like a character in itself. Yeah.
It does. We see the gaslit streets, the handsome cabs.
The crowd.
But we also see that darker side.
The crime and the poverty.
It's a world in transition.
Where tradition clashes with modernity.
And you can see why Holmes thrived in this environment.
Right. He's unconventional. He's got this sharp intellect.
Right. He's a product of his time. A Victorian gentleman who embodies both the progress and the anxieties of that era.
Using the latest science.
Yeah.
But also relying on intuition and his understanding of human nature.
You also included that excerpt about Holmes's fascination with the criminal mind.
Yeah.
He sees crime as this challenge.
It's a puzzle.
Which makes you wonder, is he really driven by justice?
Or is it something more?
Yeah, does he maybe enjoy that game of cat and mouse with the criminal underworld?
That's a great question. It hints at something darker, something below the surface.
It makes me think, how would Holmes approach the crimes of our modern world?
Oh, think about it. Cybercrime, fake news, online anonymity.
Would he be able to adapt his methods?
Oh, imagine Holmes navigating the dark web, unraveling some complex hacking scheme.
Wow. It's definitely something to ponder.
Maybe we can dig into that in part 2.
I like that idea. But for now, let's jump into some of those specific cases you chose.
Yes. There's a great mix here.
Cases that showcase his range,
From royal scandals to missing persons.
bizarre conspiracies.
Seemingly impossible murders.
Each one giving us a glimpse into his methods, his intellect.
His understanding of human nature.
I can't wait to break them down with you.
It really is quite the collection. Stolen photographs, hidden identities, a venomous snake. We've got it all.
I know, right? Okay, so which one jumps out at you first?
Oh, well, The Adventure of the Speckled Band, for sure.
A classic.
It's got everything. A locked room, a sinister stepfather, and a murder that seems impossible.
And let's not forget the atmosphere. Doyle really builds the suspense.
He uses those Gothic elements so well.
Right, like those seemingly supernatural events.
But of course, Holmes cuts through it all.
With logic and reason.
Exactly. So you've got this eerie scenario, right? A young woman, terrified in her own home.
Mysterious whistling sounds, a speckled band found at the crime scene.
Enough to make anyone believe in ghosts.
But Holmes, of course, doesn't jump to those conclusions.
He examines the evidence,
The physical evidence, the layout of the room,
the behavior of the suspects,
and through careful observation,
and deduction.
he uncovers this chilling plot
The murder weapon disguised as a harmless rope.
delivered through a ventilator shaft.
All orchestrated by the seemingly respectable Dr. Roylott.
You know, it reminds me that sometimes the most terrifying villains are the ones hiding in plain sight.
And it's Holmes's willingness to look beyond the surface.
To challenge those assumptions.
And that makes him such a brilliant detective.
I think the speckled band also shows us something else about Holmes.
Oh, what's that?
His compassion.
Interesting. Yeah, he genuinely cares about the victims.
He wants to see justice done.
Right. He might seem cold and detached sometimes, but
But his actions show us the truth.
he's willing to risk his own safety
To protect the innocent.
to make sure the guilty are punished.
That theme runs through a lot of the cases you chose.
Like in The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, Holmes shows mercy to the thief.
He sees that sometimes circumstances can lead people to desperate measures.
Right, and he's willing to extend that compassion when it's deserved.
It shows us that even the greatest detective,
is still human?
Capable of empathy.
Okay, so what about the man with the twisted lip?
Oh, such a clever case.
Disguise and deception. Neville St. Clair.
A respectable businessman living a double life as a beggar.
It makes you think, right?
Yeah.
How many people are hiding their true selves?
Especially today, in the age of social media.
People crafting these perfect online personas.
It's easy to forget that what we see might not be the whole story.
And the man with the twisted lip also touches on something else.
What's that?
Social inequality.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
That contrast between the poverty of the beggars and the comfort of the middle class.
We get a glimpse of that underclass struggling to survive.
And Holmes, even with his upper-class background, he shows empathy for those less fortunate.
He doesn't judge them.
He tries to understand their motivations.
And even help them when he can.
It's a recurring theme, isn't it? Holmes, the outsider, fighting for those who are marginalized.
Okay, let's talk about another case you selected. The Adventure of the Copper Beeches.
Ooh, yes, that one gets dark.
It explores that darker side of Victorian society.
Manipulation, control, a young woman practically imprisoned by her employer.
It's unsettling because it highlights how vulnerable women were back then.
They were trapped in these limited roles with very few options for escape.
And it's Holmes who comes to her rescue
He sees through the lies, exposes the employer.
and helps her regain her freedom,
It's a reminder that evil can lurk anywhere.
even in seemingly ordinary places.
And Holmes is willing to confront that darkness, to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves.
All these cases, they showcase Holmes's methods,
It is attention to detail,
connecting those seemingly unrelated clues,
his understanding of psychology.
and how he uses science and technology to solve crimes.
Like he's a pioneer of forensic science, using fingerprints, footprints, long before they were common practice.
He's almost like a prototype for the modern forensic scientist.
Paving the way for all those crime dramas we see today.
That blend of intellect, intuition, and scientific method.
Makes him such a timeless figure.
He represents that triumph of reason over superstition.
The power of the mind to solve even the most baffling mysteries.
Speaking of which, there's one case you picked that really pushes the boundaries.
Oh, you mean The Adventure of the Five Orange Pips.
Yes. Seemingly supernatural events.
But ultimately explained by a secret society with a very human agenda.
It's a case that challenges even Holmes.
Forces him to confront forces beyond rational explanation.
But even then, he doesn't abandon his principles.
He doesn't dismiss the possibility of the supernatural.
But he also doesn't let it cloud his judgment.
He sticks to his methods.
Gathering evidence.
Finding that logical solution.
It shows his unwavering faith in reason.
His determination to find an answer, no matter how difficult.
And it reminds us that even when things seem truly bizarre,
There's usually a rational explanation.
it's a good lesson, right?
Yeah, in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable,
It's reassuring to know that logic and reason can still win.
even in the face of the impossible.
Another thing that stands out in these stories
What's that?
is how Doyle invites us to play detective alongside Holmes.
It's true. He doesn't just give us the answer.
He lays out the clues, the details.
And lets us follow along as Holmes puts the pieces together.
It's like a mental workout,
We get to flex our own deductive muscles.
trying to anticipate Holmes's next move.
And it feels so good when we can follow his logic.
When we see those connections and reach the solution with him,
It reminds us that deduction isn't just a fictional tool,
it's a skill we can all develop.
a way of being more observant, more analytical.
And that's so important today, don't you think?
Absolutely. In this age of information overload,
We need to be able to think critically.
to sift through all the noise and find the truth.
These stories, they're more than just mysteries.
There are lessons in critical thinking, observation, and questioning assumptions.
They encourage us to be more engaged with the world around us.
To look deeper, to search for those hidden truths.
And as we go through these excerpts,
It becomes clear that Sherlock Holmes is more than just a detective.
he's a cultural icon
A symbol of reason and logic.
in a world that can often feel chaotic and unpredictable.
He shows us that intellect can triumph over brute force.
The power of observation and deduction to overcome any obstacle.
And his popularity, it shows our fascination with the human mind.
With its brilliance and its ability to make sense of the world.
You know, Doyle also uses these stories to comment on the social issues of his time.
Oh, absolutely. He touches on poverty, class, the limitations placed on women.
The hypocrisy of Victorian society.
And while Holmes might not be a social reformer himself,
His actions often expose the injustices of the system.
he challenges the status quo.
He's a champion for the underdog.
A voice for those who are often silenced.
And that's another reason why these stories continue to resonate with us.
He represents that timeless ideal of justice and fairness.
That belief that the truth will win in the end.
No matter how powerful the forces against it.
And that's a message that we always need.
Especially in a world where truth can feel so elusive.
And justice can seem out of reach.
It makes you wonder, if Holmes were alive today, what injustices would he be fighting?
What mysteries would he be solving?
That would shed light on the complexities of our modern world.
That's a really interesting thought. Maybe something we can explore in the last part of our deep dive. You know, it's amazing how relevant these stories still feel.
Yeah. Over 100 years old, and they haven't lost their power.
Like Doyle understood something essential about us. Our need for mystery, the appeal of a mind like Holmes's.
And it's not just the puzzles themselves. It's how Doyle uses them to explore these bigger themes.
Justice, morality, human nature.
We get those intricate cases, but we also think about the meaning behind them.
You chose an excerpt from A Scandal in Bohemia that shows this perfectly.
Oh, a fantastic example. It's not just about a photograph, is it?
No. It's about power.
Deception.
The lengths people go to protect their reputations.
And of course, we meet Irene Adler.
One of a few who can outsmart Holmes.
A truly fascinating character.
She operates outside the norms of Victorian society and ultimately earns Holmes's respect.
It's interesting how Doyle portrays her.
Right.
She's not a villain.
No.
She's a worthy opponent.
Someone who pushes Holmes, makes him rethink his approach.
And she shows us something important.
What's that?
That Holmes, for all his brilliance, isn't perfect. He can be tricked, manipulated.
Even emotionally affected.
As we see with Irene.
It makes him more human, right? More relatable.
Yeah, exactly. He's not this untouchable genius.
He makes mistakes.
He has feelings.
Which reminds us that deduction
Powerful as it is,
isn't foolproof.
it can be influenced by perception, bias, the limits of human understanding.
It brings us back to that question of Holmes in the modern world.
Oh, yes.
Cybercrime, fake news, all those new challenges.
How would he handle it all?
Imagine Holmes sifting through mountains of data,
Tracking digital footprints.
exposing deep fakes and misinformation.
It's a fun thought experiment.
His core principles, would they still hold up?
I think so. That attention to detail.
Seeing the patterns others miss,
Logic and reason above all else.
those are timeless skills.
But he'd have to adapt, wouldn't he?
Of course.
He'd need to understand technology.
The psychology of online behavior.
The new ways people deceive and manipulate in the digital age.
I'd love to see that Holmes 2.0.
Blending those traditional methods with new tools.
A master of both the physical and virtual worlds.
There's that excerpt where Holmes talks about the criminal mind.
Oh, yeah, he's fascinated by it.
He understands how they think.
Their motivation.
It's almost like he enjoys the challenge.
Matching wits with those masterminds.
Testing himself against those who break the rules.
But it makes you wonder, is it just about justice for him?
Good question.
If there's some part of him that enjoys that game, the cat and mouse chase with criminals,
I don't know. It's hard to say.
Doyle leaves it open, doesn't he?
And that's part of what makes Holmes so intriguing.
He's not just a hero.
It's complicated.
He's got his own desires, his own darkness, maybe.
If he were around today,
Yeah,
do you think he'd be drawn to white-collar crime?
where the lines get blurry.
Corporate espionage,
Right.
financial fraud, maybe even political corruption.
It's a thought-provoking idea.
He's a character who transcends time, really.
Reinventing himself, adapting his methods to each new challenge.
As we wrap up our deep dive,
I think it's clear that Sherlock Holmes is more than just a detective.
he's this symbol of reason,
Yeah.
the power of the mind,
He inspires us to be more observant, more curious.
to engage with the world.
And he reminds us that even when things are chaotic.
There's a place for deduction, for logic, for that constant questioning.
Well said. I think we've really explored these excerpts.
We've delved into the methods, the character, the lasting impact of these stories,
And honestly, it makes you want to go back and reread them,
to see what else we might find.
to dive even deeper into that world.
So, to our listeners out there,
Yeah.
I'll leave you with this.
But,
What mystery in your own life are you most curious about?
ooh, I like that.
And how could you use a little bit of that Holmesian deduction to find the truth?
It's a great reminder that the spirit of Sherlock Holmes lives on,
Not just in the books.
but in the way we approach the world.
So go out there, be your own detective.
Never stop questioning, observing, deducing.
Your way to a deeper understanding of the world around you.
Until next time.